Greetings and welcome to our Sunday morning brief. And I'm Pastor here at Sunrise Church. I'm like literally at Sunrise Church in my office as I'm preparing for worship this morning. This time called Morning Brief is an opportunity for me to share just a little bit more about our scripture readings and or the sermon, kind of like the things I would also want to say or want to highlight, but just won't ramble on in the service in the sermon. So I'm going to ramble here. I'm kidding. I don't ramble. So this morning, it's the fourth Sunday of Lent. And so we're hearing the gospel reading of what we normally call the prodigal son story. And when I say what we usually call it, because that's how we tend to focus on this story, the parable is the prodigal, which is a fine focus to bring to this story. But I want to highlight that in many places, the story is actually titled The Lost Son and the Waiting Father. And I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit more about the waiting father in this story. So first of all, it's really important for us to remember that this is a story that Jesus told. This wasn't a factual event. Absolutely true. And Jesus told this story, this parable that holds truth in order to bring attention to the ways in which all those around him were viewing God and understanding God's nature and God's very being. So with that said, let's talk about this waiting father. And because what I really want to talk about this morning for this morning brief is this idea of how God is at work, how God moves among us, how God relates to us as individuals and as community and society. And the way I like to think about this, and the reason why I'm a United Methodist minister, is how John Wesley talked about God's movements of grace. So in the parable, the waiting father, he's there waiting for the son to come back, the younger son, who had taken as much of the property and money that he thought was owed to him by the father and took off for that foreign land. And often we think, well, then, that's the choice the younger son made. And so the father must just, kind of get on with life and just forget about him. But that's not how the story tells us that the father was, how the father acted in the story. That instead, the father must have spent time every day looking at the horizon, waiting for his son to return. So John Wesley, who is the founder of Methodism, he talked about God's movement of grace that happens in three ways. And for United Methodism or Methodism in general, this idea of grace and the three movements of grace is pretty distinctive to our heritage. So you may not hear that in other like churches or denominations. But that doesn't necessarily make us better. Just this is how we're different as United Methodists. And so John Wesley would talk about prevenient grace and justifying grace and sanctifying grace. That God's grace actually works in and around and among us in some different ways. And so in this prodigal son, lost son, waiting father parable, we get a picture of this prevenient grace of God, that the father who was looking in the distance, waiting for his son to come over the horizon, that this is the grace of God that is prevenient. That is kind of that grace that's there even when we don't know it, we don't see it. We just aren't necessarily attuned to it, much like the younger son did not know that his father was waiting for him. He made the assumption that his father would not be even happy with him, much less greet him or be waiting for him. And so this prevenient grace of God is the grace that surrounds us when we haven't recognized it, when we don't accept it, maybe, when we are just off doing our own thing in the foreign land of wherever, right? But the grace of God is still there. It doesn't nullify God's grace. And then John Wesley would talk about justifying grace, which is the grace of God that welcomes us when we are ready to accept that grace, when we're ready to accept the relationship or the fullness of God's love for us. In the story, this is that moment when the son sees his father and the father runs to him. Remember, the son had this speech all prepared and he doesn't even get to say the speech. And God, or the father, welcomes him, hugs him, gives him a kiss, is so happy that he's back. That's justifying grace. We don't earn that. It's just given to us. And so that's justifying grace. And then John Wesley talks about sanctifying grace, which is the grace of God that helps us make the changes in our life, helps us to grow, helps us to become more of who we were created to be. It's the grace that when we kind of screw up on the journey of faith, when we kind of miss the mark, when we don't live fully into our gifts and graces, then it's God's sanctifying grace that forgives us and continues to build us up, continues to help us grow. So we kind of see all of these movements of prevenient and justifying grace in our prodigal son, the waiting father story this morning. And I want to say also, and we'll say this later too, I hope, that the story is all about God. We may see ourselves in the story, and we do see ourselves in this parable, the prodigal son, the waiting father, and of course the elder brother. But this is all about God and who God is and how God relates to us, with us, and through us. And so I hope that you will tune in this morning to worship, whether you tune in person by coming to our church at 421 East Spalding Avenue, or if you tune in online through here at Facebook or on YouTube, or if you will be tuning in at another time during the week, because we have this great gift of God's grace. And it is such good news, right? That we want to share it, we want to own it, but we also need to share it. So I hope that you will be able to participate with us in worship at some time. So, so with God's grace surrounding us, we can go through our day to day, knowing that we live in the presence of God always, that God's love is poured out for us in all ways, and therefore we can live at peace. So may this day, the rest of your day, be the very best of your days, and hope to see you in church. God bless and take care.